to Straight Up Paleo, where we talk all things nutrition straight up. I'm one of your hosts, Christina Rice. I'm a holistic health coach and a nutritional therapy practitioner in training currently living in Los Angeles. I'm also the creator of the health and wellness blog, addictedtolovely.com, and the host of the Actually Adultish podcast.
And I'm your other host, Kara Halderman. I'm a nutritional therapy practitioner from Dallas, Texas, creator of careaboutit.com, and co-host of the Low Carb Conversations podcast. In this podcast, we will be discussing all things paleo, health, and nutrition, along with answering questions straight from you.
If you want to submit a question for us to answer on the podcast, head to straightuppaleo.com or email us at straightuppaleo@gmail.com.
Remember our disclaimer. The materials in this podcast are only to be used for advice and are not to be used in place of general medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
If you want to support the show, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and a review on iTunes. Enjoy the show.
Hey, Christina, what's happening?
Hey, Kara. I'm just chilling Friday night for Friday evening, hanging out. What's new with you?
You know, just made some food, made a good stir fry. I feel like that's all that I eat in my life because it's the easiest meal on the face of the planet.
What was in it?
It was a bunch of kale, asparagus, some ground bison, and then I made like a really creamy coconut milk sauce. It was super good.
Yum. I have some ground bison in my fridge too. I was going to have that for dinner.
I love bison. It has like no fat though.
I know. That's why you gotta load up on the mayo. But
Yum.
It's funny because you just ate dinner and I just ate lunch.
The struggle.
So, whoops. I also tried delicata squash last night.
How was it?
For the first time. It was good, but it wasn't like great. Like it was fine. Like it wasn't bad, but I think it's overhyped a little bit. I really wanted to try it because everybody just posts about it all the time. And they're just like, delicata is the best squash in the world. And I'm like, I mean, it was good, but I prefer butternut.
Really? You're a butternut kind of girl.
I am a butternut kind of gal. So yeah, that's what's happening.
Is that what's new with you?
Yeah.
Delicata squash.
Yeah, delicata squash. But well, the other thing is if you haven't already picked up my holiday ebook, you guys, you should definitely pick it up. Kara's impressed with it. I'm very happy that she likes it, but we talk about how to have a healthy paleo Thanksgiving. We have a ton of recipes in there. My friend Kaylee, Christina, and I created this with so many healthy, delicious, simple recipes. And we also have a huge section on all the lifestyle factors of having a healthy holiday season, like movement, digestion, handling family drama, how to handle your own mindset. And then we plan out the week for you so you don't even have to think about it if you're doing any events. So we have a Thanksgiving checklist and a week-long calendar to follow and all the things. So definitely head to my website to pick that up and use the code Straight Up Paleo for 20% off.
Do it. You guys really should. I said something about it on my stories today. I genuinely don't like ebooks. I don't know. I'm just not an ebook person. Mm-hmm. And a lot of ebooks that come out there, no offense to some people, I just don't think they're like the content is worth it. That's just my opinion.
No, I agree.
Like,
people put out content just to put out content. And I'm like, I could have read this in a blog post. I didn't have to download this.
Totally. But I was getting to the point where I actually bought your ebook because I wanted to support you, and I was reading it and I was just like, this is good. I really like this. This is really good information. And the recipes looked really, really good. So I think for anybody that gets stressed out during the holidays, or maybe they like obsess a little bit about what they're going to eat, or they exercising, or like just freaking out about how to stay healthy, I think it's a really, really good resource. So props to you. I'm like really proud of you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy you're proud of me. I want to make you proud. So I'm really proud of it and I'm excited about it. And people have already been making recipes. They've been sending me pictures.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Which makes me so happy. So definitely check that out, you guys. And also, if you haven't already joined our Facebook group, make sure you join our Facebook group, Straight Up Paleo Pals. It's the best.
Yes, we have good combos in there. But I want to jump in and kind of tell you a little bit about our guest for today. Our guest for today is Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. And if you don't know her, she is a blogger. She has an award-winning blog at thepaleomom.com. She also has the Paleo View podcast. She's a co-host on there. And she's written the book, the New York Times Bestselling, The Paleo Approach, and the Paleo Approach Cookbook, and The Healing Kitchen. And she's coming out with another new book. She's also a scientist, an award-winning scientist at that. And her blog is seriously incredible, you guys. If you haven't been to thepaleomom.com, all of her articles are very much science-based. She's super into research, and it's really, really impressive, all the stuff that she pulls together. And she's just a huge voice in the autoimmune paleo community, and it has changed not only her life, but her resources have changed the lives of probably like thousands and thousands of people. And she's just a wealth of knowledge. So I'm really excited that we get to chat with her today, hear some more about her story, and ask her all the questions about AIP, because I know you guys are pretty curious about AIP as well, and if it's right for you. So we'll definitely get into the ins and outs of that.
Yes, I cannot wait to chat with her. She is so intelligent, and I have spent hours on that blog, and I know Kara has as well. So if you guys like to read well-written blog posts and read about different research in the nutrition space, you should definitely check out her blog. So I cannot wait to chat with her.
Yes, we're super excited, and you guys are going to love it. So let's cut over to the interview.
Hi, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for coming on. Kara and I are so excited to talk to you. We've been talking about this for a while now, and we have so many questions to ask you. So I hope you're ready.
I will do my best.
Yes, we have all of the questions. But first of all, I'd love if you could just kind of summarize for us your journey to finding paleo and AIP and like how you got to where you are today.
So how long do we have? Because even the summary is a long story. The short form of this story is, so I have a background in medical research, and as a graduate student, as a postdoctoral research fellow, I was really struggling with my health. I was morbidly obese and had about a dozen different diagnosed health conditions, including metabolic syndrome. I was borderline type 2 diabetic. I had high blood pressure. My cholesterol was not crazy high, but a little bit high. I had asthma and allergies and irritable bowel syndrome and acid reflux and a whole pile of skin conditions, including some autoimmune skin conditions and fibromyalgia. So I was in sort of just chronic pain. And I hit this point when my first daughter turned 1, where I realized that the end of this road was diabetes, and I had done my PhD in a vascular surgery research laboratory, so I was intimately familiar with the complications of diabetes. So I had some extra motivation arising from that background knowledge. And I found motivation in that realization that I really needed to change things. And so the first thing that I did was I went on a low-carb diet. And I lost 100 pounds, which was great. And it reversed the diabetes, and normalized my blood pressure, normalized my triglycerides. But the other conditions that I was struggling with actually got worse. And I was, having anxiety attacks and frequent migraines, and my digestive system was a mess. I was on 6 prescription medications, and my skin was crazy. So when my second daughter was like 1.5, I had this I lost all this weight. Why aren't I healthy? Crisis, quarter life crisis. We'll call it a quarter life crisis. It's probably closer to midlife, but that's fine. And so it was that frustration with, I had thought all growing up that, my big problem was that I was overweight. And if I just lost the weight, then my life would be perfect and everything would be magical, was the very naive point of view that I had. And so I had successfully lost weight, and I was still so struggling with my health, and I was still in chronic pain, and my digestive system was crazy, and my skin was ridiculous. And having skin conditions has a very similar feeling to it as being overweight, because it really feels like you're wearing this badge of look at how unhealthy I am, like visible to everyone all the time. So it has the same kind of emotional challenges that go with it. And so it was that frustration of, I got to a healthy weight, but why aren't I healthy? That really spurred me to dig deeper. And so I started with, I had psoriasis and lichen planus, which is another autoimmune skin condition, and really bad acne and eczema. But I had heard that eczema can be linked to food sensitivities. So that was where I started. And I just sort of started on, Dr. Google. But I had hit on some of the science articles around skin conditions that Lauren Cordain had written. And his articles, even back then, were always really referenced. So then I was able to go to the medical literature and read the articles that he was referencing. And that was the beginning of me starting to think about health as not just about how much I weigh, and start to think about food as not just, if I eat too much, I'm going to be overweight. And if I eat less, I'm going to lose weight and get to a healthy weight. And, like food to me was like, it was calories and it was carb grams, right? That was how simplistic I thought of it beforehand. And this realization and then this sort of self-education really got me thinking about food in terms of micronutrients and in terms of food toxins and avoiding food toxins, and also hitting micronutrient sufficiency and really understanding, for example, the importance of vegetable fiber. And I got into like crazy nerd town. So I decided, after researching for 3 months, like this was not a rash decision on my part. It took me a long time to talk myself into doing this thing that is the paleo diet. But then I decided I was going to do it as soon as we got home from a family trip, and I did. I started August 31st, 2011. And within 2 weeks, I was able to go off of all of my medications that I was on at the time. My skin mostly started clearing. My digestive problems completely went away. I've never had a migraine since. I had energy like I'd never remembered ever having since I was a kid. My chronic joint pain started to go away, and I was so sold that I became this like crazy zealot. And I would like go around my life, and like I was getting my hair cut, and like it was a great clipped haircut, right? So it's not like a hairdresser that you have a relationship with, and yet I still felt like I needed to tell that person that the bagel that she was eating was going to kill her, right?
Oh.
So it was like completely not cool and not appropriate in any way.
I've done this. I've done this before.
Same.
In the grocery store, I'm like, put the cookie down. Put it down.
So many things wrong with that right now.
I know.
Yeah. I found myself like really just obsessed with learning more. And the personal experience was so dramatic that I just bought into the entire philosophy, behind the paleo template really quickly. And so I needed an outlet. And after I'd been paleo for about 2 months, I knew that I wanted my kids to try this. I knew I wanted my husband to try this. And I'd already started like not buying any gluten-y foods for them and just letting them kind of eat through the pantry as we were going to kind of slowly transition. And I was introducing them to new foods. And I turned to my husband on a Thursday and I said, so what do you think of like me starting a blog? And the like crazy behind the scenes story is like 2 weeks earlier, I had gone on this like long rant at my yoga class about why blogs were stupid. Then apparently I changed my mind in 2 weeks. And my husband was like, yes, do that. That's a great idea. So I think he was because he became like, I was embarrassed at how hard it was for me to talk about anything else. And so he got the brunt of it because, husbands do. And I think he was just so excited for me to have an outlet. So I had the idea to start a blog on a Thursday, and I launched it the next Sunday, 3 days later. And that's thepaleomom.com. And that allowed me to do a couple of things at the same time. So it allowed me, an outlet for my enthusiasm. It allowed me a place to be the nerd that I am. So I write, because I have this medical research background, I write about the science behind the various facets of paleo in detail. I don't believe in dumbing things down. I believe in taking the time to explain the detailed science. And if you just take the time to provide, here's the background science you need to be able to understand this concept, and now here's this concept, explained in accessible terminology, I think that as long as the reader is also patient, then I can explain any concept to any person, right? So I really think that that's important for providing legitimacy to the paleo movement, for motivating people, because I think that really understanding the consequences of our choices is really key to being motivated to make the right choices. And then it also allowed me to continue to dig deeper. So I had this tremendous success right away, but my skin, while it cleared a bit, substantially initially, it didn't clear all the way. And that's because autoimmune conditions are a little bit tricksy, and it's a different, people with autoimmune conditions like me are a little bit more sensitive to some inflammatory compounds in foods and are much more sensitive to nutritional deficiencies than the average population. So it required, I had to start digging deeper. And at the time, Rob Wolf's book had just come out, and there was a 2/3 page insert about, oh, by the way, if you have an autoimmune disease, here's 5 more foods that you shouldn't eat. And Lauren Cordain had an article on his site, oh, and by the way, if you have autoimmune disease, here's 5 more foods you shouldn't eat. And they weren't the same lists. The lists, there was a lot of overlap, but they didn't quite match up. And then there were 2 websites that had compilations. So it had those 2 lists merged. And because I'm a science nerd, I want to know why. So I had, really steeped myself into the science behind the paleo template, but this extra understanding immune function and understanding what it is in these foods that might work for somebody who's healthy and might not work for somebody with autoimmune disease, that was a really interesting question for me. So as I was learning the science and experimenting on myself and writing about it, that was what ended up for me becoming a career. Sort of, I call it my accidental career, because it really came out of just needing an outlet for my enthusiasm and trying to, I was a stay-at-home mom because I wasn't healthy enough for this scientific career, but I have this really, inquisitive, science-minded brain that needed exercise. And it kind of all came together in a way that, it wasn't just changing my health. Everything that I write is all the things that I'm interested in are the things that I find are relevant to me. So the quest was answers for myself, and then always trying to understand what's unique to me versus what's generally applicable. But it became something where I had the opportunity to provide resources that would change other people's lives. And that has been such a key motivation for me over the last 6 years. Oh, 6 years tomorrow.
Wow. Congratulations.
Wow. 6 years tomorrow since my first blog post. So that has been the underlying theme behind everything is, taking the research that I've done to try and understand my health and fix my health, and then provide that information to everybody so that people don't have to hit the health lows that I had to hit in order to find answers. That's really if I was to distill everything that I do, that would be it.
Yes, that's amazing. And I'm so glad that you created your blog, and that's what I love most. You really explain the science, which I appreciate so much, because I'm honestly kind of sick of reading all these posts that just say, eat this, don't eat that, oh, you should do this or that, and they don't have any evidence. So I really appreciate that you go into the science and you make it digestible. It's hard to explain all of those things in a digestible way, but you do make it accessible to everybody. So thank you for all of that work. And I think we want to kind of hop in right now and ask questions about autoimmune paleo. But first, I just really wanted to ask quickly, the first time you went on a low carb diet, what kind of low carb diet were you on? Because it wasn't low carb paleo, right? Or was it just?
It was not. So I kind of edited out of my story, but I actually went on a low carb diet in my early 20s, which was the first one that I was on, and it was Atkins, or Atkins inspired. And I lost a lot of weight and then had a massive health crash, which, in hindsight was almost certainly an autoimmune flare. But I hadn't been diagnosed with all of my autoimmune conditions at that point. But I also ended up with adult onset asthma at that time. And my lungs were so inflamed that I was coughing up blood. And I was apartment bound for 3 months and put on extremely high doses of prednisone, which I had all the side effects. I gained 50 pounds in the first 6 weeks, another 80 pounds in the year that followed. And I traced that back to the combination of a diet that was too low carb. I was also running marathons, so I was training ridiculously, and I was a graduate student. And anybody who's been through grad school who's listening knows that they put you through the ringer. It's an incredibly stressful time. So I think it was sort of that combination of physical stress and emotional stress with nutritional deficiencies that really drove me into that flare. And it took me, I was on steroids of some form or other for about 7 years after that. It really took me almost 10 years to really recover from that particular flare. So then when I went on a low carb diet the second time, that was what I fell back on because that's what I knew. So again, it was very Atkins inspired. It was, meat and a lot of salad. So not strictly gluten-free and certainly not dairy-free, but not that different from what a low-carb paleo diet would look like. And when I look back at that, I see, I know now how sensitive I am to gluten and to dairy, so I think that was certainly part of the problem. But I see nutritional deficiencies as being really key, and also the fact that, not that I advocate high carb by any stretch, but I certainly advocate moderate carbohydrate now after doing some really deep dives through the scientific literature, in part to try and understand why it was that low carb made all of my immune-related conditions so much worse. My metabolic conditions improved and my immune-related conditions worsened. And it really has to do a lot with the fact that some carbohydrate is really required for a lot of the systems that feed into the immune system. And in particular, it's really difficult to get sufficient fiber for a healthy gut microbial community on what is sort of traditionally considered a low-carb diet, like Atkins-style diet. So when I come up with carbohydrate recommendations now, it really is rooted in hitting a minimum fiber intake and then also the micronutrient intake from vegetables. And when you do that, as opposed to trying to be like 50 grams, like I was trying back then of carbohydrates, you end up typically more in the 100 to 200 gram range, which is still far lower carbohydrate than the standard American diet, but certainly too high carbohydrate to qualify as what is typically considered low carb.
Totally. So do you see 50 grams of carbohydrates to be too low to get the amount of fiber and nutrients that you need?
Yeah, I consider it wholly inadequate. Okay. I consider it impossible to get sufficient nutrients from 50 grams of carbohydrates.
Okay. Yeah, I really actually like your stance on the whole like fiber and whatnot. You're really big into fiber and vegetables and vegetable consumption, which I think is something that's kind of missing in the low carb community. Yeah. And maybe, that's why they're not so successful, because some people may not be so successful.
I think there's a way that you can, I think there's concepts that come from the low carb community that are really important, right? So blood sugar regulation is extremely important. I think adequate protein intake is extremely important. I think the focus on quality fats that has been embraced by the low carb community these days, I mean, that didn't exist, 20 years ago when I first did this, but these days the focus on high quality, healthy fats is really important. So I think there's some keys there that are really great. I think the underemphasis on the role of fiber is a really big problem. And I think the fear of slow burning carbohydrates is a big problem, right? Because, we talk a little bit, and we're definitely going on a tangent now away from the autoimmune protocol, but there's this idea of being fat adapted and this idea of having a flexible metabolism. But a truly flexible metabolism will use whatever fuel is available. So a really flexible metabolism uses carbohydrates right after your meal when you have carbohydrates in your blood. And then when those are done, it just goes, oh, now I burn fat. And a truly flexible metabolism just switches back and forth depending on what's there. What happens with low carbohydrate diets, especially over long term, is they can make you insulin resistant. So when carbohydrates are there, holy smokes, you have a cheat meal once, your body doesn't know how to process them. But it also makes you leptin resistant, which is probably the big, those two things together is probably one of the big drivers of immune issues. And, we are starting to see some of this getting teased out in the literature, looking at, low carb or ketogenic diet approaches with people with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, and it worsens their condition. And it's almost certainly because of these, what the long-term low carb diet does to hormones that are very important immune modulators. And then the other part where, so the USDA recommendations for fiber is 25 grams a day for women and 30 to 38 grams a day for men. But hunter-gatherers consume somewhere between, depending on the analyses you look at, there's some analyses that say they're consuming about 47, 48 grams a day, and there's some hunter-gatherers that are consuming 200 grams of fiber a day. And if you look at spinach, which I think is it's definitely a low-carb vegetable. Spinach is the food in the modern food supply that has the highest amount of fiber per total carbohydrates that you can find. So it's about 50-50. So about half of the carbohydrates in spinach is from fiber. So you would have to consume, in order to just hit 25 grams, which is probably not actually enough. Like probably we should be looking at hunter-gatherer intakes of more like 50 grams. You would have to consume 50 grams of carbohydrates from spinach, which is something like 40 cups of spinach.
That's a lot.
Yeah,
that is so much.
Now, if you steamed it, it would decrease.
I was going to say it will down to nothing real quick.
Yeah, but it would still be a lot because it would still be something like 10 cups of spinach because spinach only loses about 3/4 of its volume. So that's way more than most people. And that would be to just get 50 grams of total carbohydrates. So when you look at denser carbohydrate sources like a sweet potato, you can hit that same carbohydrate or that same fiber intake with about 3.5 cups of sweet potato. But then you're getting like 150 grams of carbohydrates. So it's a denser fiber source, but there's more carbs per fiber gram in a sweet potato. So the way that you hit this, I mean, hitting 50, and that's my target every day, is 50 grams of fiber. And it takes work. And I mostly eat non-starchy vegetables. And then I have usually 1 serving of fruit a day and 1 or 2 servings of a starchy vegetable a day. So this is still not crazy high carbohydrate. Like it's a funny line to walk because it's definitely not low carbohydrate, but I consume typically about 150 grams of carbohydrate a day. And that is this like perfect place to get about 50 grams of fiber, 45 to 50 grams of fiber a day. And that is just so phenomenally important for a healthy gut microbiome, which then feeds into immune system and gut barrier health, neural health. So our bacteria make neuroactive compounds that actually can control how leaky the blood-brain barrier is, which is crazy town to think about your gut bacteria affecting your blood-brain barrier, but controls inflammation in the brain, controls neurotransmitter regulation. So there's this huge feedback from our brains to our guts. And of course, our brain then feeds into every system in the body. So if the brain, is not regulating itself well, if the nervous activity is diminished, if there's inflammation in the brain, that translates to poor health in all of our other systems. So gut microbiome is so phenomenally important, and the best thing that we can do for our gut microbiome is consume moderate fat, make sure we're getting plenty of omega-3 fats, and consume at least 8 servings a day of vegetables and some fruit. And that is, what at this point, thousands of studies are confirming. And I feel like even in the standard paleo community, there isn't still this as big an understanding of how important high vegetable consumption is for overall health yet. If you look at the studies, high vegetable consumption reduces risk of every chronic illness. I mean, there's a stronger correlation between vegetable consumption and osteoporosis than there is between dairy consumption and osteoporosis. Like, the best thing you can do for bone health is consume lots of vegetables. It's far more important than whether or not we consume dairy products. It reduces risk of cancer, autoimmune disease, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and there doesn't seem to be a cap. So it's really interesting, because I think that a lot of the original science that was supporting low carb diets, I think there's a really big difference between cutting out, I'm not even just refined carbohydrates, but grain carbohydrates. Even whole grain carbohydrates, I don't think are doing us any favors. Mm-hmm. I think there's a really big difference between cutting those out and then cutting out vegetables, which are just packed full of essential vitamins and minerals, but also phytochemicals. So we also have this tremendous body of scientific literature showing that high phytochemical, right, things like polyphenols, high polyphenol content is protective against chronic disease like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. And our main source of those, or our only source of those, really is vegetables and fruit. I mean, you get you get the same amount of polyphenols from an apple as you do from about half a cup of olive oil. So calorie for calorie, the apple is a much, 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 much denser source of polyphenols than olive oil. So I think that trying to rejig our thought, and it's not that I want to say eat all the carbs, it's that I want to say some carbs are fine if your blood sugar is well regulated, and that fiber is really important, and that nutrient sufficiency is really important. And those things actually trump anything that might anything else that might be going on in terms of macronutrient ratios. It's far more important to get micronutrient sufficiency and adequate fiber intake than any kind of health effects that we can get from tinkering with macros.
Wow. Okay. I have 5 million questions in response to this.
There's so much going through my head.
Okay. Let me just start with, so you talk about how, you said, there's really no cap to vegetables. Mm-hmm. Do you find that true all the time though? What about people with gut issues, or can there be any downsides to consuming too many? Is there such a thing as too many for some populations?
So let's parse that a little bit. So scientific studies that look at vegetable consumption, most of them are correlative, although there are intervention studies that look at vegetable consumption and specific chronic diseases, which is, I think, really exciting when you do intervention studies. But typically, what they basically do is they take a group of people and they say, okay, these people had between 0 and 1 servings a day. These people had 1 to 2. These people had 2 to 3. And most people, actually, the average in America is 1.5 servings of fresh fruits and vegetables a day, which is pretty sad. And it used to be in the olden days, 5 years ago, that it was so hard to find people to enroll in these studies that consumed more than 5 servings a day that they would just have a 5+ group. And they would say, look, the 5+ group is the healthiest. They either, in a correlative study, have the lowest risk of whatever we're looking at when you correct for all the other factors, or in an intervention study, they have the best outcomes. And obviously, the intervention studies are the more impactful research to look at. In the last 5 years, that upper limit has been pushed up to 8. So now we have, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, and then 8+. And we see, again, lowest risk of disease with 8+, and best outcomes in intervention studies with 8+. And so when I say there's no cap, there doesn't seem to be, like, granted, it's really hard to find a lot of people who consume 20 servings of vegetables a day to be able to do statistical analysis. So it's hypothetically possible that 20 servings a day is not great, except that we do see that kind of intake in hunter-gatherers. So we do see the intake of 200 grams of fiber and 500, 600 grams total carbohydrates, like really high carbohydrate intake in some hunter-gatherer populations that are consuming more like 65% of their calories from plant foods and 35 animal foods. So these typically are hunter-gatherers that are more along the equator.
Wow.
So we do have that example. So that's that like whole section. Now, there's a very big difference between looking at these studies of people's habitual intake or an intervention study where you're actually like working with a health coach to get you to eat this thing. And in these intervention studies, they often even buy the groceries for people. Like they're really usually interestingly designed studies. And it's another thing to say, okay, you've been eating, let's say you're paleo and you've been doing really well and you've been eating 4 servings of vegetables a day, which is, 3 times the national average. But now you want to go up to 8. One of the things that can happen is because our gut bacteria are responsible for digesting the fiber, right? They digest the fiber and they help liberate nutrients. They help form nutrients when we consume vegetables. They do lots of really interesting things. But the beneficial strains that are helping us to digest those vegetables tend to be slow growers. So somebody who goes from 4 servings a day to 8, and not everybody, but some people can experience digestive symptoms. And it's because it takes some time to adjust and it takes some time for the microbiome to adjust to that increased vegetable intake. So I usually recommend that 8 a day is the best target, at least for what we can see now in the scientific literature. But that doesn't mean like just go out tomorrow and eat all the vegetables. If you know you're somebody who tends to have a more sensitive digestive tract, to work up to it slowly. But that being said, like once you work up to that 8 a day, there doesn't seem to be a group of people for whom high vegetable intake is contraindicated. So clearly somebody with extreme insulin resistance is going to want to do a measured carbohydrate approach in conjunction with this, ramp up in vegetables. So you're not going to want to do 100 grams of vegetable carbohydrates all in one meal. Like most people with insulin resistance are not going to have good blood sugars after that. So keeping that part in mind, but ramping up slowly. But there's not a health condition out there in which you would say, oh, and if you have this is, this vegetable intake is bad. So even if you look at, some of the health conditions that have traditionally been put on low residue diets, like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's or diverticular disease, the new studies are showing that vegetable fiber is actually protective and can actually reverse some of the disease activity. So even in diverticular disease, they've completely gone away from these low residue diets. And like they used to say, like, don't eat popcorn, right? And don't eat all of these, don't eat roughage, right? Remember the old, right? Don't eat roughage. And they've gone away from that because the studies actually show the opposite. The studies show that the fiber types, especially hemicellulose fiber, which is a really important fiber type in the stems of leafy greens, and like the ridges and the ribs in leafy greens. That fiber type in particular seems to increase healing and lower risk of, for example, bleeding from diverticulitis. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of condition in which you would say, don't eat this. Maybe there are some genetic conditions in which people produce kidney stones from oxalate, dietary oxalates. So normal calcium oxalate crystals, as kidney stones, are not related to dietary oxalates. It's related to endogenous production. And high vegetable consumption actually protects against those kinds of stones. Even high oxalate containing vegetable consumption. But there is like a genetic disease in which your body does take dietary oxalates and make oxalate stones. It's quite rare. But like there's one example of somebody who would need to be more careful about the types of vegetables they were consuming. But generally, for all of the like normal health conditions that we have out there, other than like it's okay to ramp up slowly, and if you have digestive symptoms as you ramp up, things that you can do to help your digestive system adjust to the higher fiber intake is puree. So like do smoothies or pureed soups, cook your vegetables that partially breaks down the fiber, and then ramp up slowly and add probiotics. And once you kind of, acknowledge that any big dietary shift of any kind is going to require some kind of adjustment from our bodies, even if we're making a really positive dietary shift. Once you acknowledge that part, then there really doesn't seem to be any group of people for which high vegetable intake is contraindicated.
Okay, got it. Yeah, because I know some people, let's say they have issues with vegetables and can't digest, but basically what you're saying is you need to give your body some sort of like adjustment period. So I can totally see that and relate to that. And you guys, we're totally going to jump into autoimmune protocol. We promise we're going to spend a huge chunk on it. Christina and I are just fascinated by what you have to say right now. We love all of your science and everything that you have so much knowledge and background on macronutrients. And I feel like macronutrients are so obsessed about right now, and everyone's kind of freaking out about like how many protein, fat, carbs should I be eating? So our last question about macronutrients is, I know you kind of mentioned a moderate type fat intake. So what does like moderate fat look like to you? And like, what do you think about all of the like super high fat diets that are going on?
Yeah, so moderate fat, I would say, is between 30 and 50% calories from fat. What's really interesting is that once you get upwards of, say, 60%, which is typically the cusp in scientific studies for what's called a high-fat diet or a Western-style diet, there's some interesting effects that I think aren't particularly well recognized within our community right now. So there's certainly the high fat diet causing cardiovascular disease, that's been very well debunked. I think what is probably most interesting, there's some research showing that once we get up to that kind of level of fat intake, that can disrupt our sleep. So we actually sleep more deeply with a more moderate fat intake. So that I think is a very interesting consequence that is not very well recognized. But the other one is that a high fat diet, and it's saturated fat and omega-6 fats generally, can shift the species of bacteria growing in our guts towards undesirable strains, in the same way that a low fiber diet can. So balancing omega-6s and omega-3s is really important for our gut bacteria, but also not overdoing saturated fat. So if you look at hunter-gatherers, they on average consume about 13% of their calories from saturated fat. Even if you look at the Inuit, they're not eating tons and tons of saturated fat. And, they're at about 15%. So there's sort of this misnomer that they're getting this like crazy high amount of saturated fat. They're actually consuming a tremendous amount of monounsaturated fats and omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. So high saturated fat especially, and also high omega-6 fats causes this shift towards undesirable strains of bacteria in the gut. And what's interesting in studies is you can actually go a long ways towards correcting gut bacteria simply by eating more fish or doing a fish oil supplement. It's obviously not as sensitive as increasing vegetable intake. So if you can get a really big shift in bacteria by increasing vegetable intake in 3 to 4 days. By changing fat consumption, you're looking at more like a 2-week long period of time. But in the grand scheme of things, that's a really fast intervention. Like even 2 weeks is like, holy smokes, we see this great big result in 2 weeks. That's not a very long period of time to be seeing such a big shift in gut bacteria. Mm-hmm. So I think those are really big effects. And there are still some studies showing that very high, especially saturated fat intake, can cause some changes in the dynamics of blood vessel walls that is potentially undesirable. So even if high saturated fat intake is clearly not the culprit behind the rise in cardiovascular disease, that doesn't mean that it's completely inert from a vascular health standpoint. But I personally think that the bigger issue with high fat intake is what it does to the gut microbiome, and that that doesn't mean, right, like 30 to 50% is still a fairly high fat intake.
It is.
Right?
It's pretty high. Yeah.
But I would not recommend going above about 50. If you look at hunter-gatherers, they typically consume between 20 and I think 58 is the top of the range. So if you look at hunter-gatherer macronutrient intakes, they vary depending on where in the world people are, but most of them land around 20 to 30, 20 to 40, 20 to 40, right? So I kind of look at that and I go, well, it's not too different from a third carbohydrates, a third protein, a third fat. So I kind of say go 30, 30, 40, and it doesn't really matter what's the 40, and it can be different on different days. And that hits the average of hunter-gatherer intakes. It also hits, it's a lower sort of conventional medicine recommendation for carbohydrates, but it hits the right ranges for protein and for fat. I think the AMDR for carbohydrates is something like 60%, which I think is definitely too high. But it hits that middle range. And the funny thing is when you balance macronutrients, it really doesn't take a lot of work. So if you just eat some kind of quality meat, some kind of vegetables, and one of your vegetables is something kind of starchy, and you cook your food or dress your food in some kind of tasty fat, but you don't go crazy, you don't add the brick of butter to your sweet potato, right? You typically fall in those ranges without trying. So the balanced meal approach typically ends up there without any particular effort. I actually think that, I generally recommend doing a food journal, and rather than really focusing on the macros, focus on the micros and look at the vitamins and the minerals and look at fiber, right? So look at omega-3 and omega-6 balance, look at vitamins, minerals, and fiber. And those are the things that I think, your macros will fall in a good range if you're trying to get all of your vitamins and minerals, healthy fats and fiber, and making sure you're getting adequate protein. I guess that's one of the ones that we so much talk about fat versus carbs, and we tend to not think about protein. What's really interesting is as much as studies have really shown that the caloric deficit is the thing that matters when it comes to weight loss, and low fat diets and low carbohydrate diets basically perform equally as well. And the reason why they work well for weight loss is because they provide some kind of structure that ends up in a caloric deficit. And I think that low carb diets have a little bit of an edge up because they tend to automatically focus you on more satiating foods. So you tend to not feel as hungry. So it takes less work to stay on a low carb diet than it does to stay on a low fat diet. But from everything else being equal, there's no metabolic advantage to a low carb diet. And the studies in the last year and a half have proven that conclusively. But there does seem to be some benefit to higher protein intake. And these studies look at 30% protein intake, but the average American's only consuming 10% of their calories from protein. So 30% is easy on a paleo diet. There does seem to be some advantage to kicking up the protein a little bit. It helps us preserve lean muscle mass during weight loss. So if you lose weight with a large caloric deficit, you're going to lose some muscle and some fat. But if you have higher protein intake, you won't lose as much muscle. And if you have a more modest caloric intake or caloric deficit, that's also a way of protecting muscle. So there does seem to be some benefit. And then there is some interesting research showing that higher protein intake basically makes it easier to stay on plan. So people have an easier time making healthy choices when they're consuming a higher protein diet, which I think is something that's worth thinking about. Like when you can structure a diet so that it's easier to make good choices, it's easier to choose vegetables, and it's easier to drive right past McDonald's and not go through the drive-through. Like I think that has some really important merit to consider. And I think paleo kind of already incorporates all of those concepts almost by accident because its original framing sort of was tangential to all of that science. But that's why the paleo diet has been so effective in clinical trials as a weight loss diet, because it's much more micronutrient sufficient than any other dietary approach. It tends to result in a caloric deficit because of focusing on satiating foods in the same sort of way that a low-carb diet does. So studies show that people on average will consume 400 less calories a day when they adopt a standard paleo diet. So I think all of those things are I really like this focus more on micronutrients, on fiber, on adequate protein, on healthy fats, and worrying a little bit less about where macronutrients fall.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I liked the way that you put that it's a little more effortless to balance your macronutrients than you really think that it is. And maybe we're overthinking it. And if we just think about quality micronutrients, that everything would kind of fall into place a little bit more. So I appreciate you diving into macros with us. That was a fun talk. We're always fascinated with the macros, but I want to get into AIP a little bit because we've talked about it on our show before, and some of our listeners want to know if it's going to be right for them or if they should try it out or whatever. And to summarize AIP, well, what most people think AIP is just no eggs, no nuts, no seeds, no nightshade vegetables, no grains, no dairy. They think of all the things that they can't have. So yes, but I want to know, like, who would AIP be good for? And can you have success on AIP even if you don't have autoimmune conditions?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that question with a resounding yes. I recommend AIP for anybody with chronic illness that is not seeing the results that they're hoping for with a standard paleo template. Okay. So that means clearly people with autoimmune disease, if a standard paleo template, which I definitely recommend trying first, is not sufficient to mitigate your disease, but also if you have cardiovascular disease risk factors that aren't correcting themselves with a standard paleo diet, or if you have type 2 diabetes, or if you have kidney disease, right? So there's really any chronic illness is, because inflammation is part of the pathology of every chronic illness, the autoimmune protocol is really designed to provide the immune system with the resources and the opportunity to regulate itself. And so it reduces inflammation. So reducing inflammation is beneficial in all contexts. And so the way the autoimmune protocol works, it acknowledges that people with autoimmune disease, and this also is sort of shared with many other chronic illnesses, have immune systems that are more sensitive to overstimulation and typically have some kind of reduced ability to regulate. So in autoimmune disease, right, a lot of the genetic factors that predispose us to autoimmune disease are genes that have some kind of role within the immune system, and typically have roles within parts of the immune system that are either useful for detection of an invading microorganism or have roles in regulation. So the immune system can be sort of divided by its jobs. So there's different cells in the immune system whose job it is to attack, right? I'm going to attack that virus. I'm going to attack that dirt that got into that cut. I'm going to whatever it is. This is not supposed to be my body. I'm going to attack it. But then there's this whole part of the immune system whose job it is like, they're like the middle management, and their job is to regulate the response and to turn it off when the job's done. Like otherwise, if we didn't have that part of the immune system, you'd get a flu once and you would have a runny nose for the rest of your life because the immune system would never turn itself off. So it's really important that we have this part of the immune system that turns itself off. That part of the immune system is also the same part of the immune system that detects if the attacking part of the immune system is attacking the wrong thing. So it's the part of the immune system that also can recognize if the immune system is attacking our own tissues. And that's what happens in autoimmune disease, right? The immune system loses the ability to differentiate some protein in our bodies from a foreign invader. So it thinks that, like I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which means my immune system thinks my thyroid gland is the same thing as a virus or a bacteria, and it needs to be attacked. So that's a failure of the regulatory arm of the immune system to detect autoreactivity and shut it down. So this regulatory arm of the immune system is really, really tremendously important. And what's interesting is there's this really strong link between how the immune system fails in autoimmune disease and how it fails in cancer. So cancer is also a failure of the immune system. The accident that happens, that a cell transforms and becomes a precancerous cell, is just chance. I mean, there's like UV exposure and cigarette smoke and other things that can increase the likelihood of that happening, but it is just a flip the coin, oh, it happened. Our immune system is supposed to be patrolling the body to look for cells that, do this transformation and kill those cells. And so just like the immune system fails in autoimmune disease and instead attacks something it's not supposed to be attacking, in cancer, it fails to attack this thing it's supposed to be attacking. And it really has to do with, it's very much the same, it's almost like an opposite. So it's a lack of balance in the immune system is the root behind both of these health problems. And by giving the immune system the nutritional resources it needs, by regulating hormones that feed into the immune system, by improving gut bacteria and having a diverse and robust gut microbial community, by doing things like sleeping enough and managing stress and being active but avoiding overtraining, all of these things feed into how the immune system regulates itself and how efficient it is at attacking. And so when you can dial in all these things, which is what the autoimmune protocol is, you basically provide the perfect situation for the immune system to operate normally. And that means that not only do you reduce the attacks on our own tissues and autoimmune disease, but you reduce the inflammation that is causing vascular damage and cardiovascular disease. And that means that you can have an immune system that is going to better detect precancerous cells and kill them and hopefully not get cancer as well.
Yes, that was a beautiful explanation. Thank you so much for explaining that. And I know so many people have seen such incredible life-changing benefits from following AIP. It's so remarkable. And I know that there's a period of reintroduction after some time, and I'm curious, are there any foods that are eliminated in AIP that you think are best kept out of the diet and not reintroduced? For example, I know that lectins are a really hot topic right now, and nightshades, and some think that nobody should be consuming those. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, nightshades, of all the foods that are endorsed on the standard paleo diet, nightshades are definitely the most inflammatory. But they're a really interesting food because they have these really inflammatory compounds. I mean, like tomatoes have 3 different chemicals in them that have been investigated for use in vaccines as an adjuvant. So an adjuvant is the thing we add to a vaccine to ramp up the immune response to make sure that we develop immunity against the dead virus that's in that vaccine.
Wow.
So useful for making vaccines work, maybe not something we want to get from a garden salad.
Yeah.
Right? So, and if you think about, even a couple hundred years ago, like women were accused of being witches if they cooked with tomatoes because they were considered poisonous. Like it's,
oh my gosh.
Right. Tomatoes have a very interesting history. So, I think that nightshades are certainly the least likely to be tolerated by people with a genetic predisposition towards autoimmune disease for that reason. But on the other hand, right, nightshades are really nutrient dense foods. They have a lot of nutritionally redeeming qualities. So I try to, I think of like Paleo and the Autoimmune Protocol as basically creating a pros and cons list for every single food. And so the pros are like, what nutrients does this food have that's going to support my health? And then the cons list is what compounds are in this food that might undermine my health. So what is in this food that's inflammatory, right? Things like the lectins, prolamine and agglutinin classes of lectins, glycoalkaloids, which are a type of saponin, and tomatoes unfortunately have all of those. Things like high phytate or digestive enzyme inhibitors, right? What is in this food that might undermine my health? Like refined carbohydrates is going to spike insulin. I would put that in the con category, right? What is in this food that might undermine my health? And then you just kind of balance it. So the foods that are on the autoimmune protocol are all the foods that have tons of nutritional redeeming qualities, right? They've got lots of nutrients and not very much stuff that might undermine our health. And the stuff that's eliminated is the reverse, stuff that has all kinds of things that might undermine our health and not very much nutrients for our bodies. And I think the difference between paleo and autoimmune protocol is just where you draw the line for all the foods that fall somewhere in the middle. And with the autoimmune protocol, you just say, well, no, even if you have some nutrients, but if you have these inflammatory compounds, I'm going to avoid you. And on paleo, you go, yeah, look at there's these great nutrients. So let's include tomatoes and let's include eggs and let's include grass-fed dairy. I think on the autoimmune protocol, you just go like, no, the potentially problematic compounds are not worth it, at least initially. So the autoimmune protocol is at its heart an elimination diet with the idea that you eliminate the foods that are the most likely culprits behind driving the immune system to be overactive. And then at the same time, there's this extra focus on nutrient density. So eating more seafood, more, shellfish and sea vegetables and fish, eating a lot of vegetables, incorporating organ meat, and really flooding the body with nutrients and dialing in the lifestyle factors that are important immune regulators, right? So all of this focus on these things that are going to provide resources and opportunity for the immune system to regulate itself and take out anything that might be stimulating the immune system in any kind of way. But once the immune system starts to work properly, it's really important to start playing with those foods that are eliminated and try reintroducing them and identify individual tolerance to them. And the reason is just because of those nutrients that some of those foods can have. And I certainly wouldn't put tomatoes at the top of the list, but I would put like pastured eggs, grass-fed dairy, and nuts and seeds very high up on lists because those do have really important nutrients. Then if they can be successfully reintroduced, they're really adding value to a diet. So those are foods I definitely recommend playing with. But is there a line in the sand of no? I don't think so. I think that once the immune system regulates itself, when you start looking at the context of an overall nutrient-sufficient diet, you've prioritized sleep and you've managed stress and you've learned to be active. All of those things are inputs to health as well. And I think that when you have all of those other things dialed in, tolerance to suboptimal foods or compounds that are suboptimal in foods like a tomato increases. And then you get the benefit of the nutrients. So I even go as far as like, go ahead and try some traditionally prepared gluten-free grains, try some traditionally prepared legumes. Like there's way more things to try before you get to that. But if introductions are going well, I don't see any like end of the road where I would maybe I would draw the line at gluten. I think that's probably a fair line to draw the line at, just because we're starting to see some links between certain genes and gluten intolerance, and those happen to be autoimmune genes. But I think that as long as reintroductions are methodical, and we take our time, it would take a long time to get up to. I'm going to try some fermented quinoa I don't know if that's a thing. I just made that up.
I don't either.
I haven't seen it out there yet. Okay. Someone's going to steal that idea, though.
Right?
It's going to be on the market.
But I think that experimentation and really understanding our own individual responses to foods, I think that's a really important part of the health journey. And I think it's a really important part of sustainability. I think that, for me, knowing that I can go into a restaurant and I don't need to worry about potatoes or rice or corn, right? That those things are going to be fine. But I do need to worry about tomatoes and dairy and gluten. Like, that's really important knowledge for me to just navigate life. And I wouldn't know that if I hadn't tried reintroducing those foods and found that potatoes were okay and rice was okay and corn was okay. And they're not part of my daily diet. But I know that if I have them once in a while, I'm fine. But tomatoes even once is going to wreck me. So and I found that one out the hard way. Unfortunately, that's how you find those things out with reintroductions. But it's fine. I got through it and I'm fine. And now I know I go to a restaurant and here's these 3 things that I say I can't eat and I don't worry about the other things. And that's really important knowledge for just finding balance in life and being able to navigate life without being stressed about food. I think being like really wound and stressed about, I can't eat that. I can only eat this. I think that can end up causing so much stress that it undermines the health benefits of the good foods that we're eating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I mean, kind of going off of that. So I just want to clarify. So what if somebody doesn't have an autoimmune condition? Do they need, you're saying like they don't necessarily need to be worried about things like nightshades?
Yeah, generally. So I recommend a standard out of the box paleo diet. Yeah. So vegetables of all kinds, quality meats, get some seafood, have some fruit, nuts and seeds and eggs, fresh herbs and spices, healthy fats for cooking, right? That's what I would recommend, even as a starting point for somebody with autoimmune disease. If that is not helping somebody reach the goals that they want, there's certain questions that they can ask themselves. So lifestyle is really important. So am I getting enough sleep? Am I getting 8 hours every single night? Am I getting movement throughout the day? Am I taking movement breaks if I have a desk job? Am I getting my more, moderately intense exercise time throughout the week? Am I adequately managing stress? And is my diet nutrient dense? Am I missing out on any important nutrients? And that's where the idea of doing a food journal and looking at vitamins and minerals and fiber can be really important. That's like the starting place. And if those things are all kind of dialed in already, then the autoimmune protocol is the next place to go, because the autoimmune protocol takes all of that and just like ramps it up to this therapeutic level. So then the autoimmune protocol, and then you go, okay, so now I'm going to do the autoimmune protocol for a few months, because it's not a 30-day challenge thing. The autoimmune protocol, it's usually done for a few months, and then you start reintroductions. Now, was there something in there that was the missing piece? Yes or no? Because so often what's holding us back is a food intolerance or food sensitivity. It's not always something that's going to show up on testing. And the autoimmune protocol typically eliminates the most likely culprits that are maybe still included on a paleo diet. But if then the autoimmune protocol is not enough, then it's time to go see a functional medicine or integrative medicine specialist and dig deeper, because there are some things that diet and lifestyle cannot fix. And that's where working with a functional medicine practitioner who has, their training is very much looking at root causes and addressing root causes of disease. It's very compatible with the paleo template and the autoimmune protocol. That's where you then dive in with a medical professional at that level. But generally, we've seen, at least, thousands, tens of thousands of anecdotal cases of people who didn't get the results they wanted on paleo or primal or Weston A. Price, and then went to the autoimmune protocol and everything magically came together for them. And there's now clinical trials. There's a clinical trial that's actually being published this month using the autoimmune protocol as defined. They actually gave the patients a copy of the Paleo Approach, which is my first book about the autoimmune protocol, and the Autoimmune Wellness Handbook, which is a really fantastic book written by my friends Mickey Trescott and Angie Alt. Gave them these books and got them walked through the autoimmune protocol with them, and after 6 weeks, 73% of these patients with inflammatory bowel diseases were in full clinical remission. So it is a really powerful, therapeutic approach. It is a nutritional intervention for autoimmune disease. So it's definitely worthwhile trying if standard paleo is not getting you as far as you wanted to get. And I would recommend trying the autoimmune protocol before doing something like tinkering with macros. Like, I think that's the most common, like, okay, paleo did this and this and this, but I didn't get this, so I'm going to tinker with macros. I think evaluating lifestyle factors, evaluating nutrient density is the first place to start, then the autoimmune protocol, then a functional medicine specialist. Now, the functional medicine specialist says, I think we need to tinker with macros, then, like, let's go for it. But I think that's I think it's a very unlikely thing to actually change results compared to dealing with nutrient deficiencies, for example.
Yeah, I wish somebody would have actually told me that a while ago when I was experimenting with my own health. I did paleo, and then paleo worked for a while, but I still had some issues. And so I was like, I'm just going to adjust my macros. Still had a lot of issues. In some ways, it actually made it worse. Yeah. And to my knowledge, I don't have any, to my knowledge, I mean, I may find something out later, but I don't have any sort of autoimmune condition, but I do have autoimmune disease that runs in my family. And I tried AIP for a couple of months, and it's like all of the mysterious, weird symptoms that I was having just went away. So I am attesting to, like, that's why I say, like, if you are really having some chronic stuff going on, systemic, like, type inflammation, like, it's worth a shot to totally do it, even if you don't think that you have autoimmune disease.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think your experience is particularly unique either. Right. So I think, it's a template that's not put together, haphazardly. It's based on a tremendous body of scientific literature, as is the paleo template. But I think what the autoimmune protocol has that's very powerful is that it includes the context of a immune system that is up to shenanigans, and maybe hormone systems that are not regulating themselves well. Like it's created in the context of, you're not starting with somebody who's healthy. And that's why when we're not experiencing the health that we want to experience on a standard paleo diet, it's why it can be the magic thing that makes everything come together.
Totally. I completely agree with that. And I wanted to ask one question about micronutrients. I know everyone's different and everyone has different needs for micronutrients, but what would you say your top, like, micronutrients to consume would be? What are your, like, favorite ones you think everyone needs more of?
I mean, wait, can't I just say all of them?
Right.
I think... So I will periodically do, like, a 3-day food journal. I don't like tracking all of my food all the time, but I like to do, like, a 3-day food journal and just see where I'm at. And I use Chronometer, but, like, MyFitnessPal would be very similar. I put in everything that I eat, and what I look at is I look through, it just has essential vitamins and minerals, but I look through all of them, and I make sure that all of them are in the, like, green. I got at least the RDA. And I think the RDA is probably a underestimate of what we actually need. But so that's why I target that as a minimum. But I think that nutrients that we tend to be deficient in, most of us, I mean, vitamin D is a huge one. And even in the paleo community, right, like, you actually have to be outside a lot and eat a lot of fish to get enough vitamin D. I actually recommend getting tested, and that's one, like, supplement if you're low, and retest because you don't want to overdo it. So keep an eye on it, test every 3 months. But, like, vitamin D is really important, and it's hard in our modern societies to actually get enough. Not to mention that a lot of us can be very bad converters and all of that other stuff. So I would say vitamin D is really important. I think the animal form of vitamin A is one that we tend to be deficient in. So we're getting that from, like, grass-fed dairy, grass-fed meat, but like the best food source is organ meat. And it's one of those like little emphasis of like, oh, organ meat's really important. Also, it has a lot of vitamin D, so that's good too. Two birds with one stone. And then the other one that I would say that even on the paleo diet, we can fall quite short on is zinc. So in the standard American diet, 73% of people don't consume enough zinc. There's no analyses in terms of the paleo diet, what percent of us might not be getting enough. But zinc is the second most abundant mineral in the human body after iron. And it is extremely important in immune regulation. And also the vitamin D receptor is a zinc-based molecule. So it's probably essential for vitamin D signaling. And vitamin D, of course, is a steroid hormone and is important for almost every biological system in our bodies. So I would highlight those as probably like my big ones. But I just really think that the goal needs to be hitting the RDA of every single vitamin and mineral every day. And I think that takes some effort. It really takes knowledge of what foods are good sources. It takes a focus on organ meat and shellfish and sea vegetables and fish and tons of vegetables. It's not actually straightforward to get everything that we need without some thought. And then once you track it for a few days and you realize calcium is one of the minerals that tends to be lower on the paleo diet. So then you go, okay, well, what are the foods that I'm going to eat that are really rich calcium sources? And once you figure that out and you incorporate those on a more regular basis, then it's easy. But it's part of the educating ourselves and really understanding that food is, it's not just fuel. It is the raw materials for every single structure in our body and for every single chemical reaction in our body. And so when you start to think of it in terms of raw materials, and you have all these different raw materials we have to get, and different foods have different amounts of raw materials, and I'm going to learn which raw materials I don't get with my normal choices and how I'm going to change my choices to get those raw materials. I think that's a really important thing that we can all do just by doing a 3-day food journal and having a look at micronutrients.
Yes, I love that. I love your focus on micronutrients, and not enough people in this space talk about that. And I'm also really glad you brought up organ meats, because I am obsessed with organ meats, and more people need to incorporate them in their diets. I swear that's nature's best vitamin. But so this has been really amazing to talk to you, and I think Kara and I could both listen to you for hours, because you're just such a wealth of knowledge. But I do want to touch on your new book before we wrap up. So I know you have a new book, Paleo Principles, coming out. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about that book and when it's coming and how they can get it?
So the book releases November 7th, which is, as we record, is just next Tuesday. And it is when I pitched this book to my publishers, I said, I want to write the book that brings scientific validity to the entire paleo movement, because I'm not ambitious at all.
No.
And I granted, I am totally biased, but I really do believe that is what I was able to accomplish with this book. So it is an all-in-one guidebook and cookbook. It has the detailed science behind every facet of the paleo diet. And then it has 230 recipes and 20 meal plans. It uses my sort of signature, I'm going to take the time to explain all of these things, but it goes through everything that we've touched on today is talked about in detail in this book. So it goes through macros, it goes through all of the micronutrients, it goes through fiber, it goes through different considerations for different chronic health problems. So it goes through cancer and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and weight loss and autoimmune disease. And it really dissects every single facet of the paleo diet and lifestyle and explains the science behind it. And just in case people are intimidated by the science, it's very visual. There's a lot of infographics, a lot of graphic summaries of information, a lot of little text boxes that summarize information or summarize the actionable, what's the take-home message of all of this science, like what is the thing that you're going to now go and do at home. And so it has a lot of different devices in the book to make it very approachable and very readable. And it's so heavy. It's 672 pages.
Isn't it like 6 pounds?
It's a 6 pound.
Oh my gosh.
Love it.
My joke has been, it'll make you healthy just by carrying it around.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it really is, it is the book that I felt that this community needed in order to be able to continue to grow. And it's been all consuming now for like nearly a year and a half. So it's been just an amazing project, and I'm very, very proud of it. I really do. People say books are like children and you're not supposed to have a favorite, but this one's my favorite.
I could see why.
I'm really proud of it. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm really excited to read it myself. A 6-pack, like,
Me
I don't know, I'm a big reader, and anyone that pours this much like heart, soul, I'm sure blood, sweat, and tears into a book that massive. Yeah, it's probably going to be great. And I think this podcast may come out before the book releases, but I'm sure you can order it online through your website. When does it come out? Where can you get it?
You can get it everywhere. So on Tuesday, November 7th, it's going to be available. So it's already available for pre-order on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. But as of Tuesday, it's going to be in bookstores across North America. I don't know if it's actually delayed before it gets to Europe and Australia. Sometimes books have a delay and sometimes they don't. So I don't actually know about that. But certainly you can still, like, Book Depository has them. So Book Depository will deliver. And so that's a good way to get copies internationally. And Costco is going to have it on opening as well. So if you're a Costco member, head over to Costco and get a copy. It'll probably be the cheapest way to get it. Yay for Costco. And if this does air before my book tour, I'm going to be in Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, Long Island, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Atlanta over the first 2 weeks of November. So I recommend people go. And if I'm anywhere near, come find me. You can get the information about like exactly where I am, what dates and what times at thepaleomom.com/events.
Yay. Perfect. By the time I think people will hear this on the 9th, so her book will be out and ready, you guys. You're probably going to love it, so go get it. And we just want to say a big thank you for coming on the show today. I'm so happy we got to ask you all of these questions and get just some really fabulous explanations. Really great. And we really appreciate everything that you're doing. Your blog, for sure. I think Christine and I were like binge reading your blog the other night because we just couldn't stop. So if you want to know more about her, head to her website, thepaleomom.com. And if you want to keep the conversation going and chat a little bit more about AIP, just join our Facebook group, Straight Up Paleo Pals, and we can talk some more about it. But other than that, once again, just a big thanks for coming on the show, and we had an awesome chat today.
Thank you again for having me. This was really fun.
Alrighty. All right. Bye.